Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 CRDCN Data Forum. We have a packed morning/afternoon of programming for you all. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Grant Gibson. I am the Assistant Director of Research and Evaluation at CRDCN and today's MC. On behalf of myself and CRDCN Central Staff, thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to go over a few rules of engagement for the day. Pour nos participants francophones, si vous voulez profiter d'une interprétation simultanée des séances, vous pouvez accéder à notre Microsoft Conversations avec le lien fourni dans le chat. Je ferai maintenant. Des instructions complètes sont disponibles sur le site web du forum. Notez que vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français pendant la section questions-réponses. The first rule of engagement will be to make sure that all your questions are coming to us via the Q&A feature in Zoom and not through the chat. We'd like to keep that open for messages from us as the organizers. If you would like a machine learning interpretation of today's events in another language, please join our Microsoft Conversations page at the link in the chat. After each session, there will be a short questionnaire in Zoom to help us understand how the sessions were received. Following today's event, there will also be a larger post-event survey through which we would also appreciate hearing from you. I will be introducing most of today's speakers and moderators. This will be the briefest of introductions as we are tight on time today, but I would encourage you to see the forum website to learn more about today's speakers and see their full bios. With that out of the way, I'm now going to bring in Joanne Provençal, our research program director, to begin the day and introduce our first speaker.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the CRDCN 2022 Data Forum. Before our programming begins today, I would like to acknowledge that McMaster University, the host institution for the Canadian Research Data Centre Network, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We begin our forum today by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe Nations and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. I encourage you to visit Native Land Digital, a space where non-Indigenous people can learn more about the lands they inhabit and the history of those lands. Excuse me. As some of you may know, in my capacity as CRDCN Research Program Director, I meet quarterly with colleagues from the First Nations Information Governance Center to discuss areas of possible collaboration, information sharing, co-learning, and training are among the collaborative efforts that we have discussed. I look forward to learning more about Indigenous data sovereignty from our first presenter today, Aaron Franks, Senior Advisor, External Relations and Strategic Initiatives for the First Nations Information Governance Center. Aaron, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joanne. I'm going to start by getting the tech out of the way and sharing my screen. There. Now I understand, even though my slides are up, you can still see and hear me. Is that happening? Great. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and it's exciting to be addressing the Data Centers Network and other colleagues. My name is Aaron Franks. I work at FNIGC. I'm speaking to you from unceded, unsurrendered territory, Algonquin territory in Ottawa, where I work and live and play. Our head office is also here, and our branch office is also here, and our head office is in Akwesasne. So I want to acknowledge the land where I am, and also of my of the organization that I work for. So today I'm going to very concisely introduce FNIGC's work, First Nations data sovereignty, the OCAP principles, and spend as much time as I can in our short time together giving you some detailed information on how OCAP is put into practice through our First Nations Data Center and the OCAP-based governance and stewardship of that data. So a little bit on FNIGC, and as Joanne has mentioned, CDRCN has been collaborating with us for some time. We've only been around as a not-for-profit organization since 2010, but the roots of our work actually go back quite a few years before that. Our organization comes from the self-organized First Nations regional leadership coming together in committee form to design and deliver a series of socioeconomic and well-being surveys to First Nations reserves and northern communities that the federal government had not been doing. And it's from this process of working ethically and focusing on data governance that the OCAP principles emerged, and we'll talk about those in a second. So we're guided by principles, research ethics, and a cultural framework that's developed by First Nations for First Nations. And as a national organization, we're really a sort of facilitator for collaboration. So under the FNIGC umbrella, regional First Nations do their work locally and autonomously and come together at the regional level where it's best, where data processes are aggregated and data services are best provided at a regional aggregated level. And then at the national level, we coordinate the delivery of the surveys and do some other things, which we're about to talk about here. So our vision is that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty as matches their individual and unique worldview. So you can that's an ambitious vision, and we go about it largely through partnerships at the regional and national level, and by respecting local First Nations cultural differences and certainly their autonomy and governance. So we adhere to free, prior, and informed consent, which sometimes referred to as FPIC, and I think it's especially prominent these days in light of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other commitments that governments have made. We respect nation-to-nation relationships, so that includes the unique historical and contemporary relationships between First Nations and between First Nations and the Crown and federal government. So our work is really diverse. In the context of this presentation, we're going to focus mostly on our data collection and data dissemination activities under the national surveys, but we also do education and training. We are ready to launch soon, relatively soon. It'll be in the new year, our updated and refreshed Fundamentals of OCAP online course. We do research in what we sometimes call OIDS, OCAP, Information Governance and Data Sovereignty. So that's research about policy, law, legislation, technological developments, and the social and political implications of those. And we also do topical research on particular subjects that aligns with the priorities of our members. And that's largely the analysis and writing reports from the national survey data that we're responsible for. We'll talk about that in a minute. Our most prominent surveys are the Regional Health Survey, the Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey, and the Labor and Employment Development Survey. So those are some details, and I think it's important to also address the basics and that what is First Nations data? Well, it's actually a lot. Although FNIGC has tended to work more often associated with data around health and well-being. Obviously, First Nations data is any data on or collected from or about First Nations lands and resources. It's any data from First Nations. And it's any data about First Nations. So we generally consider data about First Nations to be sometimes associated with that quantitative data that you may be familiar with: demographics, housing, health, participation in the labor market, education, etc. Data from First Nations is really data unique to First Nations as First Peoples, as their own independent peoples who had extensive cultural knowledge, have extensive cultural knowledge, their own languages, knowledge, stories, songs, and ceremonies that are very much community information and data. And where is this data? Well, it's actually many places and only partly with First Nations. Our archives, libraries, and museums hold First Nations data. The government, federal government, holds First Nations data, particularly, but not only, the Indigenous Services Canada, universities and colleges and other research institutes, government and other research institutes. So really, data sovereignty is about exercising First Nations collective right to control the use of that data. And that begins really with the decision-making process about why is data being collected and for whose benefit. And that's been expressed for 25 years now by First Nations in Canada, largely through the OCAP framework. We'll talk about that here. So the OCAP principles are 25 years old next year, and they're developed and applied through mechanisms that are anchored in First Nations governance and decision-making processes. First Nations employ these principles as they see fit themselves to advance their information governance and data sovereignty. And while the importance of governing their own data and information has always been of importance and recognized by First Nations, the OCAP principles and the acronym were really coined and developed and came together in 1998. So the principles have been used by First Nations in Canada for 25 years. OCAP is collectively owned by all First Nations, but really stewarded at the national level by FNIGC, and the OCAP acronym is the intellectual property of all First Nations that's held in trust by FNIGC. So the principles really operate in three ways, and I think this is really important when thinking about the principles, is that they're not just we're used to sometimes thinking of acronyms as a sort of easy reminder or checklist. And there's an element there where the principles operate as a basic minimum standard, much like an ethics standard for the collection, protection, use, and sharing of First Nations data. But there's really a real driving force and set of collective rights that underpin OCAP, and that's about the benefit of community data for use by the community while minimizing harm. And even beyond that, it's really advancing First Nations rights to self-determination, self-government, and using data to inform the institutions, educational, governance, all of the institutions that are required to organize and provide services for people. So OCAP really operates on different levels, and I think it's important to think of it in that way. So the principles themselves, they can never really be teased apart, but they do each principle works together with the others in a different way. So ownership is really, it's the most, in the fundamental sense, collective ownership over data allows First Nations to take ownership over their own identity and not allow others to define who they are. And from a legal perspective, it's really that bundle of rights that First Nations hold that amounts to ownership in the context of digitized data. These are property rights, perhaps in the sort of mainstream Western sense, also human rights as well, the right to benefit from this data, the right to control it. And really, you know, ownership of data, well, data may be intangible, but it is still material with value. So the idea of ownership is still really important. Control is a little broader, but I think the key thing to remember with control is that it's a reminder to us that control over data is really about control over the process of collecting data and using it and determining its end life. And that's really about decision-making and authority as well. So the control of data is about the whole lifespan of data. And a key part of that is access. Access to data has two components. First Nations obviously need to be able to access data that's from them and about them, no matter where it's held, no matter if it's in a government database or a university archive or in a municipal data set. First Nations also need to be able to determine who else has access to data and under what conditions. And possession really is a sort of linchpin principle, in that First Nations really must be able to exert their jurisdiction or authority over data in the same way that possessing the material gives the possessor the right to enjoy that material and exercise control over it. So in a really basic way, it's one thing to own something. I might own an object, but if I'm not in a possession of it, I lose the ability to determine, well, how's that being used? Who's benefiting from it? What's happening to it? In possession, even though we're largely talking about digital data in very diverse locations, the principle still is the same in that, First Nations should be able to bring data into their own jurisdiction, under their own laws and within their own territory, and where that's not possible or desirable, to be able to extend their jurisdiction, extend their collective rights into off-site locations where data is held. And I mentioned at the beginning of the course, but one of our main tools for sharing information, understanding about OCAP is the online Fundamentals of OCAP course. It's been in existence for 7 years now. Thousands of learners have gone through and had a great experience. We've refreshed and updated it, and happy to say that to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the principles, we'll be relaunching the course in early 2023. Now, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone a little bit here and discuss the First Nations Data Center. So I don't work directly with the data center, but the work of our colleagues there is really, really central to FNIGC's work, and I think it's important part of our relationship with the data centers network and other data holders to remind people of FNIGC's own data holdings and our governance processes behind that. It's really a sort of, real world concrete example of how the OCAP principles are put into practice. And I'm going to refer to some written notes here too, which I hope isn't too distracting for you as we talk together online here. So we're going to talk about our sources of data, how we access our data online, and what the request and approval process is like. So our data sources are from our online, our online data and on-site data. The sources for that data are surveys. FNIGC is the permanent home for data from the Regional Health Survey, also the First Nations Regional Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey, and the First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey. So the data we hold consists mainly of quantitative survey indicator data at the individual, community, sub-regional, and regional levels, stored in SPSS statistical data sets. We don't hold administrative data, for example, on community health programs or hospital or education services, but the surveys do collect information related to the outcomes or the challenges of some of those programs and services. A frequent way that people can access some of our data online is through accessing the charts and graphs that can be exported for use in presentations and reports. So we extract data from pre-existing Excel tables that's already been produced for our survey reports into an application, an online application accessible through our web that generates tables that we post online. So users are then able to use the data tool to choose, view, and export the tables according to their needs. Now, this isn't a free-for-all. According, in alignment with the OCAP principles, there are limitations to how robust we make this tool. In order to minimize potential harm to communities from findings that can be potentially stigmatizing or misinterpreted, the data needs to be presented with historical, social, and political context. So the tables and charts available online are only those that are already published in our survey reports, which contain this context. And all data that is made accessible, publicly or otherwise, must be specifically approved in alignment with our approval process, which we'll describe here in a moment. We often get asked about the level of aggregation that we work with, and it's typically at the regional and national level. But in Quebec, for example, communities that have sufficient data at the community level to create charts, graphs, and their own tables, our regional partner there has created a portal where community leaders and staff can log in and access their own data in that table format. So we'll talk a little bit about the procedure for access and request for our data. So the research and data access agreements that we use ensure that data can only be used and analyzed according to the purpose of the research and the method of dissemination that's stated in the proposal. So this aligns with the OCAP principle of First Nations control over what happens to their data. And although the data table request form will gather fewer details on analysis methods and other considerations specific to academic research projects, the on-site data access application and the data table, the online as opposed to on-site forms, are similar in asking for the same information. In that, we need background information, on the steward or investigator or the organization that's requesting data, and note that anyone requesting data access on site needs to take the OCAP course. We need to know the purpose of the research. In other words, what you wish to achieve with these tables and analysis, the relevance of the data request to the goals that you outline. What does the research entail methodologically? Which survey is needed? Which variables are these to be constructed in any grouped or derived ways? Who will have access to the data and the tables, particularly in their uncontextualized form? And then the Research Advisory Working Group really pays attention to the risks and benefits to the First Nations involved. Pardon me. And they may recommend changes to the data request as a way to mitigate risks and to enhance benefits. For example, they may recommend the inclusion of more strength-based or neutral indicators, or the provision of a more fulsome historical, political, or social context to accompany the data interpretation. I'm going to need a little drink of water here. Thank you. That's better. One more sip. The First Nations Data Center work is quite complicated. We can see there's a lot of details, which is as it should be, to a lot of steps involved in accessing our data. So the last way of accessing our data is through the on-site data center, which of course with the pandemic has been put on hold for a while, but as we reopen our workspace and offices and people become more comfortable traveling and working in person, this will become another way of accessing our data. So this greater level of service offers clients access to de-identified record level data for the purposes of statistical modeling. This type of data access, which is more intensive than simply accessing our online tables, is intended for research questions that can't be sufficiently addressed through those tables. So people who are approved for this level of data access must currently conduct their work in person at the data center in our downtown office in Ottawa. Excuse me, but we do hope through the First Nations data governance strategy that at the regional level, regional information governance centers will be established with the data governance capacity at the regional level and data access capacity at that regional level. So a data access contract is entered into with confidentiality agreement and an acknowledgement of the policies and procedures of the data center, and these must be agreed to and signed off on prior to access. Just conscious of the time here to give ourselves. Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. So the policies and procedures, this is a key point here that I didn't want to miss. They're somewhat similar to those at the Statistics Canada research data centers. However, because of our familiarity with our own data sets, there's the added value of our staff being on site, being able to advise researchers in their work, which also allows for a level of monitoring and control over what's done with the data. And there is a robust workstation and file security protocol in place at the sort of physical level for sure. Laptops, phones, cameras aren't allowed. Handwritten notes are inspected before those accessing the data can leave the station. And we're looking forward to inviting researchers back to our space. I won't go into detail here, but there's an extensive checklist that the Data Access Review Committee, the Research Access Working Group, pardon me, uses when reviewing applications for our data. So it's a really robust process. We are proud of our data and happy to share it when people meet those requirements on respecting the OCAP principles and doing research that's of benefit to our First Nations partners. So I want to thank you for your time. I know you have a packed, busy day here. I've left the contact information, not for myself, but for my colleagues at the First Nations Data Center, Drew Falainen and Maria Santos. And I hope we've stimulated your interest in First Nations data sovereignty here in the context of your own work. And I'm going to end the show here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron, very much for that and for taking part in the data forum today. It really helps to contribute to learning for the CRGCN research community. And I look forward to continued work at CRGCN centrally to enable researchers to better understand and contribute to Indigenous data sovereignty going forward. So thank you again very much, Aaron.